They say you can choose your friends, but you can't choose the people who end up breaking your heart. You spend 14 years building a vault of secrets, inside jokes, and unconditional support, believing that the foundation is made of steel, only to realize one day that it was built on nothing but glass. Would you stay silent if the person you trusted most in the world, a sister in every way but blood, was being betrayed by the man standing right next to her? Or would you risk everything to pull the curtain back, knowing full well that you might be the one crushed when the stage collapses? I thought I knew exactly who my best friend was. I thought I knew the man she loved. I was wrong. And the silence that followed the revelation of the truth was louder than any scream I've ever heard. My best friend, Sarah, let's call her that, and I haven't just been friends. We've been witnesses to each other's lives since we were 14. We've navigated the awkwardness of high school braces, the heartbreak of our first real breakups, and the transition into the messy, confusing reality of adulthood. We were the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences. I knew her coffee order, her deepest insecurities, and exactly how she acted when she was stressed. We were a unit. When she called me last month, her voice shaking with a mix of terror and nervous excitement, I didn't hesitate for a second. She told me she was pregnant. Now, if I'm being completely honest, it wasn't the news I expected. Sarah's life hasn't exactly been stable lately. She and her boyfriend Mark have been struggling with finances, constant arguments, and a living situation that was, to put it mildly, precarious. But hearing the news, the protective instinct just kicked in. I didn't care about the logistics. I cared about her. She asked me to come over that evening to be there for the big announcement to her parents. She felt she needed a buffer, a friend in her corner, to navigate the inevitable tension. Mark was there too, hovering around the kitchen, looking as nervous as I'd ever seen him. The house was thick with that stifling, suburban tension you can only feel when someone is about to drop a bomb on their family. Her parents were in the living room, Sarah was pacing the hallway, and Mark was acting strange. He kept pacing, his eyes darting toward the stairs every few seconds. When the moment finally came, the house turned into a flurry of gasps, tears, and heavy sighs. It was an emotional tidal wave. Once the initial shock settled and the heavy, life-altering conversation began with her parents, Sarah signaled for Mark and me to go upstairs. She needed a moment to breathe, and her parents needed a moment to process the news that they were going to be grandparents under circumstances that were clearly less than ideal. We headed upstairs to the guest room. I felt a weird sense of responsibility to keep the mood light, even though the air in the house felt heavy. Mark was quiet, almost vibrating with nervous energy. I walked over to the desk in the corner to straighten out some books, trying to be helpful, trying to just be a good friend in a stressful time. I reached down to pick up a box of tissues that had slipped off the side of the desk. My back was to him. It was a simple, mundane movement. That's when he spoke. His voice wasn't the nervous, stuttering voice of a man about to become a father. It was low, smooth, and laced with a predatory tone that made every hair on my arms stand up instantly. He said, "Don't do that again. I'm bricked up." I froze. I literally felt my stomach drop into my shoes. It was like the room had suddenly been sucked of all its oxygen. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and stared at him. He didn't look away. He wasn't joking. There was no grin, no punchline, no nervous laughter. He was looking at me with an intensity that felt like a violation. I stammered, a pathetic, I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything by it," my voice sounding tiny in the suddenly cavernous room. I tried to convince myself I had misheard him, or that it was some twisted, high-stress defense mechanism. But the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered, told me everything I didn't want to know. I stood there, paralyzed in the corner of that guest room, clutching the box of tissues like a shield. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what had just happened. Was this a test? Was he drunk? Was he just sick? I didn't know how to process it. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled voices of Sarah and her parents. They were talking about the future, about names, about doctors, about the overwhelming reality of a life that hadn't even begun yet. And up here, just a few feet away, I was being sexually harassed by the man who was supposed to be the pillar of that future. I didn't say another word to him. I couldn't. I felt physically ill, the kind of nausea that doesn't come from bad food, but from a sudden, brutal realization that your reality has shifted. I backed away, making an excuse about needing to use the restroom, and practically bolted out of the room. I spent the next 20 minutes locked in the bathroom, washing my face with cold water, trying to force my breathing back into a rhythmic pattern. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. I was terrified, not for myself, but for her. How could I tell her? She was downstairs, likely feeling the most vulnerable she had ever felt in her life, leaning on her parents and believing that her partner was sitting quietly upstairs, supporting her in spirit. If I walked down those stairs and told her that her boyfriend, the father of her unborn child, had just made a lewd comment to me in her own guest room, what would that do to her? I convinced myself that I was being protective by staying silent. I told myself that I'd deal with it later, that once the dust settled and the pregnancy announcement was no longer the sole focus of the room, I would find a way to handle it. I would be the bigger person, at least for tonight. When I finally walked back downstairs, Mark was sitting on the sofa, his posture relaxed, his hands folded in his lap, as if he hadn't just shattered my entire perception of him. Sarah looked at me with a tired, hopeful smile. She looked so fragile. I felt like a ticking time bomb. Every time Mark looked at me, I felt a shudder go down my spine. I stayed for another hour, forcing small talk, playing the role of the supportive best friend, while inside, I was screaming. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to tear him apart. But more than anything, I wanted to wake up and realize this was all a terrible, vivid nightmare. When I finally drove home, the silence in my car was suffocating. I replayed the moment over and over again, trying to find an alternative explanation. Maybe he didn't say that? Maybe I misheard? No. The clarity of his voice, the predatory gaze, it was etched into my brain. I got home and collapsed onto my bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. I didn't sleep. My phone felt like it was burning a hole in the nightstand. I kept checking it, half expecting some kind of twisted follow-up, but the room remained silent. I kept trying to prepare myself for what I was going to do. I had decided that I couldn't just let it slide. This wasn't a one-time slip-up. This was a fundamental character flaw, and my best friend was building a life with a man who was capable of betraying her the moment her back was turned. But I had no idea that the nightmare was only just beginning. As the sun began to peek through my blinds, my phone finally buzzed. It was a notification from Snapchat. My blood turned to ice. It was from Mark. The vibration of my phone on the nightstand felt like an electric shock. I didn't want to look. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, smash it, and pretend that the world I knew hadn't completely disintegrated. But I knew if I ignored it, the rot would just continue to spread underneath the surface of Sarah's life. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was a message from him. He was at their house, in their bed, while Sarah was sleeping just a few inches away. The sheer, calculated audacity of it made me feel like I was losing my mind. He wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. He was burning them down. He sent a message that was overtly graphic, something so crude it made my skin crawl and my stomach turn over. But this time, I didn't freeze. Something snapped inside me. A cold, hard clarity took over. I remembered the stories I'd read online, the warnings about gaslighting and manipulation. If I just told Sarah, he would deny it. He would make me out to be the crazy, jealous friend who was trying to sabotage their relationship. He would frame it as me being bitter about her pregnancy, or worse, he'd lie and say I had been the one coming on to him. I reached over and grabbed my second phone, the one I kept for work, and opened my personal Snapchat. I took a deep breath, opened his message, and as fast as my fingers could move, I snapped a photo of the screen with my second phone. I did it for every single message. He was sending them in quick succession now, a stream of filth coming from a man who was supposed to be the father of the year. Each screenshot felt like a piece of evidence in a trial I wasn't sure I could win. But I knew I had to document every single word. He didn't stop. It was as if he thrived on the danger of it, the thrill of being in the same bed as the mother of his child, while he was propositioning her best friend. I was shaking so hard, I could barely tap the camera shutter button. I felt violated, yet I felt a strange sense of power. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just another person he could manipulate, another secret he could bury. Once the messages finally stopped, I didn't reply to a single one. I sat there in the pale morning light, surrounded by the glow of two phones, feeling an overwhelming sense of grief. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my safety. I was grieving for Sarah. I was looking at the end of her relationship before it had even really begun. And the thought of her heart shattering once she saw these screenshots made me want to collapse. But I had no choice. Silence was no longer an option. Silence would be an act of betrayal against her. I called her at 8 a.m. Her voice was groggy, still heavy with the exhaustion of the night before. "Hey," she chirped, the sound of her voice almost breaking my heart. "Are you okay? You left kind of abruptly last night." I couldn't breathe. I tried to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. I had to force them out, like dragging heavy stones up a hill. "Sarah," I whispered, "I need to see you. Right now. It's important. It's about Mark." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the shift in her tone, the sudden protective alert of a woman who loved her partner. "What? What about Mark? Is everything okay?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, and hung up. I couldn't explain it over the phone. If I tried, she might try to defend him before I could even show her the proof. I needed her to see the words with her own eyes. I needed the physical evidence to stand between her and the lies he was surely going to weave. The drive to her house felt like a blur. My hands were gripped so tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles were white. Every red light felt like an eternity. I kept checking the screenshots, terrified they might somehow disappear, even though I had them saved in a secure folder. When I pulled into her driveway, I saw her standing on the porch. She looked concerned, maybe a little annoyed that I'd woken her up so early. She opened the door, and as I walked into the living room, the smell of coffee and the normalcy of their home hit me like a physical blow. Mark wasn't in the room, but his presence was everywhere. The jacket on the chair, the half-finished mug on the table. It made me sick. "What is going on?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You're acting weird." I didn't say a word. I just sat down on the sofa, pulled out my second phone, and handed it to her. "Look at the screen," I said, my voice shaking. "Look at the messages he sent me while he was in bed with you last night." She looked at me, confused, then looked down at the phone. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she was going to faint. She started scrolling. Her thumb moved slower and slower until it stopped entirely. The silence in that room became a physical thing. A heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest until I could barely draw a breath. Sarah was staring at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth, reading the vulgarity, the arrogance, and the absolute betrayal written in Mark's own words. I watched her closely, waiting for the explosion. I expected the tears, the rage, the immediate demand for him to pack his bags. I expected her to reach for a lamp and throw it, to scream his name until he came running downstairs to face his judgment. But she didn't move. She just sat there, her thumb hovering over the glass screen, her face losing every drop of color, until she looked like a ghost of the girl I'd known for 14 years. Then, she did something that I never, in a million years, would have predicted. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, tapped the phone off, and laid it face down on the coffee table. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor, her shoulders hunched as if she were protecting herself from a blow I hadn't even struck yet. "He's been going through a lot," she whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of the shock I was feeling. I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "What?" "It's not just him," she continued, her voice gaining a strange defensive tremor. "He's been struggling, okay? He told me about it. He has this issue. It's a sex addiction, and it's a disease. He doesn't mean to be like this. It's a compulsion he can't control." The floor felt like it had vanished beneath my feet. I stared at her, my mouth slightly agape, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the best friend I had known since we were teenagers. "Sarah, are you listening to yourself?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "He sent me these messages while he was lying in bed with you. You were sleeping right next to him." He wasn't compelled by a disease. He was making a calculated, disgusting choice to disrespect you, me, and your entire relationship. This isn't a disease. It's a lack of character. It's predatory. "You don't understand," she snapped, and finally, she looked at me. Her eyes weren't filled with the betrayal I expected. They were filled with a desperate, frantic kind of denial. "He's promised he's going to get help. He's going to therapy. He's going to fix this. If I just leave him, if I just cast him aside because of a mistake, what does that say about me? We're about to have a baby. He's the father. I can't just throw that away." I felt my heart break. Not just for the situation, but for her. She was already so deep in the cycle of manipulation that she was using the language of recovery to excuse his abuse. It was textbook gaslighting, but it was being delivered by my best friend, the person who was supposed to be my mirror. "Sarah," I said, leaning forward, trying to reach her, trying to break through that wall of cognitive dissonance. "He didn't just make a mistake. He targeted me. He tried to turn me into a participant in his infidelity while you were just inches away. Do you not see how sick that is? He doesn't respect you. If he respected you, he wouldn't even be looking at other women, let alone trying to involve your best friend in his sick games." "He's not himself right now," she insisted, her voice getting higher, more strained. "The stress of the pregnancy, the pressure of providing. He's cracking. Everyone makes mistakes, and if I'm going to be a good partner, I have to be there for him when he's at his lowest point." "He's not at his lowest point," I countered, my voice hardening. "He's showing you exactly who he is when he thinks he can get away with it. And the worst part is, he knows he can get away with it because he knows he has you convinced that this is a disease. He's using your compassion as a weapon against you." The room felt colder than it had ever been. We were sitting in the same living room where we had shared hundreds of laughs, where we had planned futures and dreamed of the lives we'd lead. Now, it felt like a cage. She kept looking at the phone on the table as if it were a bomb that might go off, refusing to acknowledge the reality of the evidence I had provided. She wasn't just defending him. She was choosing him. She was choosing the man who had violated her trust over the friend who had been there for her for over a decade. "I can't believe you're doing this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm the one who came to you with this, and I'm the one you're treating like the enemy." "I'm not treating you like an enemy," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "But you're being really judgmental. He needs support, not judgment. If you can't support us through this, then I don't know what to tell you." That was the line. That was the moment the bridge burned. She wasn't asking for my forgiveness. She was demanding my complicity. She wanted me to sweep the truth under the rug so she could keep her perfect, fragile narrative of a family together, even if it meant sacrificing our friendship to do it. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the person I was looking at was a stranger. She was a woman choosing a fantasy over the truth, and she was willing to discard our history to protect a man who had clearly shown he didn't care about her. I stood up, and for the first time in 14 years, I felt like a stranger in her house. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the phone. I just felt a cold, hollow silence settle into my bones. The air in the room felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of her excuses. She was looking at me, waiting for me to apologize, waiting for me to say that I understood, that I'd keep her secret, that I'd continue to be a part of this charade. "I can't do this, Sarah," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my heart. "I can't pretend that what he did didn't happen, and I certainly can't be friends with a man who thinks so little of you, or me. And I can't watch you destroy yourself trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." She looked at me, her face hardening into a defensive mask. "If you really loved me, you'd be there for me," she countered. The accusation hung in the air like poison. It was a classic move, turning the blame back on the person who was hurt. She wasn't just defending Mark, she was attacking my loyalty to protect the illusion of her life. I picked up my phone from the coffee table. The screen glowed with the reflection of the morning sun, a stark contrast to the darkness that had just filled the room. I walked to the door, my hand on the knob. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, if I saw her standing there, pleading for me to understand her twisted version of love, I might lose my resolve. I walked out into the crisp air, the sound of the front door clicking shut behind me feeling like the definitive end of a chapter I never wanted to close. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage. I couldn't understand how someone I had known since we were children, someone who knew my heart better than anyone else, could prioritize a man who had shown her, in no uncertain terms, that he was capable of such a cruel, calculated betrayal. I felt a sense of grief that was almost physical. It was like mourning a death, only the person was still alive. She had just chosen to live in a reality that I couldn't be a part of. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I found myself reaching for my phone to tell her something funny, or to vent about work, or to share a random thought, only to remember the silence. I was mourning our history, our secrets, our bond. I had to unlearn the habit of being her best friend. Every day, I wondered if she'd call. I wondered if the sex addiction excuse had held up, or if Mark had moved on to the next victim, or if she was currently sitting in that same living room, crying over the same man, while he acted as if nothing had happened. But then, the perspective started to shift. I began to realize that I wasn't just mourning her. I was waking up. I had spent so much of my life tied to her, living in her shadow, worrying about her problems, and being the supportive one, that I had lost sight of my own worth. I realized that my loyalty had been used as a tool for someone else's convenience. I had been the one to go to her parents' house, the one to hold her hand, the one to expose myself to harm, all to protect someone who was, at their core, a person who couldn't stand up for themselves. I started to see the cracks in our friendship that had been there long before Mark entered the picture. I saw how she always made me the one to apologize, how my problems were always secondary, how she thrived on being the center of the drama. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I realized that our friendship hadn't been as balanced as I had told myself for all those years. Maybe the betrayal by Mark wasn't the cause of our friendship ending. Maybe it was just the catalyst that forced me to see the truth. I spent my nights writing in a journal, pouring out every memory, every conversation, every moment of hurt, until the words finally felt like they were leaving my system. I started to focus on my own life, my own goals, and the people who actually respected me. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I felt a deep, aching loneliness, when I wanted nothing more than to reach out to her and apologize, just to have my friend back. But then I would think of those screenshots. I would remember the look in his eyes in that guest room. I would remember the way she chose to believe a lie rather than face the reality of the man she was with. I kept the screenshots, not because I wanted to use them, but because they were the truth. They were the reminder that I hadn't imagined it. They were the proof that my gut had been right all along. And one day, I realized I didn't need the proof anymore. I had the memory of who I was before I met her, and I knew who I was becoming without her. I was becoming someone who stood for herself. The months following that morning at her house were like walking through a thick, gray fog. There were moments when I felt completely untethered, like a ship that had suddenly lost its anchor. For 14 years, Sarah had been the constant in my life. When I got a promotion, she was the first person I called. When I was grieving my grandfather's death, she was the one sitting on my bed in silence, holding my hand. We had built a shared language, a private map of the world that only we understood. Losing that wasn't just a breakup. It was an amputation. But the silence from her side was deafening. She never reached out. She didn't text to apologize for the way she treated me, and she certainly didn't call to tell me that she'd realized what a monster Mark really was. Instead, through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I heard fragments of her life. She was working through things, they said. She was focusing on the baby. It was as if I had never existed, or if I had, I was merely a cautionary tale, the judgmental friend who couldn't handle the complexities of real love. It stung. God, it stung. There were nights when I'd be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had been too harsh. Was I too quick to judge? Was I truly being a bad friend for walking away? My brain would play back those scenes, the way she looked, her eyes swimming with that desperate, pathetic hope that she could fix a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient accessory. I realized then that my guilt was a lie I was telling myself to avoid the pain of the truth. She didn't want to be saved because she was terrified of being alone, and she was more than happy to sacrifice me to keep that fear at bay. As time went on, the anger started to settle into something much colder and more permanent. Clarity. I began to look at my other relationships, the ones I had neglected while I was busy being Sarah's constant support system. I saw the friends I had ignored because Sarah needed me to go on a random errand with her, or because she was having another crisis that only I could solve. I realized how much of my own energy I had poured into a black hole. It was like I had been watering a dead plant for years, waiting for it to bloom, never realizing that the soil itself was poisonous. One afternoon, about 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, a place we used to frequent every Saturday morning. I saw a couple walk in, and for a split second, my heart skipped a beat, thinking it was her. It wasn't, but the reaction reminded me of how much trauma I was still carrying. I pulled out my phone and looked at those screenshots one last time. They were still there, tucked away in a hidden folder. I looked at the words Mark had sent, the lewd, disgusting, manipulative words, and then I looked at the timestamp. I hit the delete button. I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need the evidence to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my mind. The validity of my pain didn't depend on the proof of his villainy. I knew what happened. I knew how I felt. And most importantly, I knew that I had acted with integrity. I had tried to warn her. I had tried to protect her. And when she rejected that protection, I had the self-respect to step away. Deleting those messages felt like a physical release, a way of exhaling a breath I had been holding since that night in the guest room. I started to grow in ways I never thought possible. I threw myself into my work, I reconnected with old friends, and I learned how to set boundaries that I never knew I was allowed to have. I stopped being the person who was always available, always forgiving, and always there to pick up the pieces of other people's messes. I became the person I had always hoped to be, but never had the space to become because Sarah's drama always occupied the center of the stage. I think about her sometimes, especially when I see things that remind me of our past. I wonder if she's happy. I wonder if she's realized that the sex addiction was just an excuse, or if she's still living in that same fragile house of cards. But then I realized that it doesn't matter. Her life is her own, and the path she's chosen is not one I can walk. She chose a man who disrespected her, and in doing so, she chose to lose the one person who truly had her back. It was a trade-off she made, not one that was forced upon her. I think the hardest part of the entire ordeal, the part that really sticks in your throat like a jagged piece of glass, isn't even the betrayal itself. It's the realization that you can't save someone who is actively enjoying the cage they've built for themselves. You spend so much time thinking that people want the truth, that they want to be set free from the lies, only to find out that for some, the lie is the only thing keeping them standing. Sarah needed that lie to survive the pregnancy, to justify the life she'd chosen, and to keep from admitting that her world was crumbling. And because I refused to be a brick in that wall of deception, I had to be cast aside. It's been over a year now. The seasons have changed, and so has the landscape of my life. I've found a new rhythm, one that isn't dictated by her moods or the chaos of her relationship. I remember walking past the street where we used to live, and for a split second, I had the urge to text her. A stupid, trivial thought, something about a show we used to watch, or a silly memory that popped into my head. I hovered over her name in my contacts for a long time. My thumb was shaking, and for a heartbeat, I felt that old, familiar tug of obligation. That old best friend code that said, no matter what happens, you don't walk away. But then I looked at the contact photo. It was an old picture of us, back when we were 22, glowing with the kind of naive, unbothered happiness that only comes before you learn how cruel people can really be. And I realized that I wasn't missing her. I was missing the memory of her. I was missing the person I thought she was back then. The Sarah I knew, the one who would have stood by me, the one who would have been just as disgusted by Mark's behavior as I was, didn't exist anymore. She had been replaced by a woman who chose comfort over character. There's a peace that comes with finally accepting that some people are meant to be chapters in your book, not the entire story. We were together for 14 years. That's a long time to invest in a soul, and I don't regret the love I gave her. I don't regret being the kind of person who shows up when a friend is scared, even if that friend ends up turning her back on me. That's who I am. That's my integrity. But I have learned that there is a line between being a supportive friend and being an accessory to your own destruction. I crossed that line once, and I paid the price for it. I will never cross it again. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about me. Does she look at Mark and see the man who propositioned her best friend while she was sleeping? Does she lie in bed at night, wondering if I was right all along? Or does she double down on the excuses? Does she tell herself that I was the one who changed? That I was the one who walked away? It doesn't matter. The narrative she builds to protect herself is her burden to carry, not mine. I've laid down that weight. I've stopped trying to convince her of the truth because the truth is already there, living and breathing in every one of his actions. If she chooses to ignore it, that's her tragedy, not mine. I've grown so much since that day. I've learned that when you remove the toxic people from your life, the ones who drain your energy and treat your loyalty as a commodity, you suddenly have so much room to grow into your own person. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine. It's authentic. There's no performance, no covering up for anyone else's sins, and no more gaslighting. I'm free. It makes me wonder, though, about the rest of you. Have you ever been in a position where you saw the truth about someone you loved dearly, and they chose to cling to a lie? How do you deal with that level of betrayal? Not just from the perpetrator, but from the person you expected to be on your side. Do you think there's ever a point where you can go back? Or are some bridges just meant to be left in ashes? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you have stayed silent for the sake of the friendship? Or would you have done what I did? And if you're enjoying these stories about real life, the hard truths, and the journey of moving forward, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and it lets me know that I'm not alone in these experiences. We've all got stories that stay with us, and sharing them is the only way to make sure we don't carry them alone. I've realized that the greatest gift I got from that entire disaster wasn't just losing a friend. It was gaining myself back. I'm no longer defined by the chaos of other people's lives. I'm the author of my own. And for the first time in a long time, I'm excited about where the story goes from here. The pages are blank, and for the first time, I'm the only one holding the pen.